Welcome to the My Friend the Friar podcast, and thanks for listening. If you like My Friend the Friar and want to support us, please consider subscribing or following us if you haven't already done so. And if you found us on YouTube, then don't forget to click the notification bell when you subscribe so you'll be notified of new episodes when they release. Thanks again, and God bless.
Thank you for joining us. We are your hosts. I'm Father Stephen Sanchez, a Discalced Carmelite priest.
And I'm John Lee, a run-of-the-mill cradle Catholic. And today we're talking about sainthood, sanctity, holiness. Am I forgetting anything else?
Do you have a favorite saint, son?
You know, I've been thinking about this ever since we started discussing this episode, and I don't think I do. My patron saint, or my is it your patron saint? When you get confirmed, your confirmation saint. So mine's Peter, and I don't know why I ever picked the guy, but I'm glad I did now because he. I heard someone the other day talking about the apostles saying that you're only as strong as your weakest link, and so Jesus made sure to start with the weakest. And I don't know, I kind of liked that because, you know, he was always opening his mouth just to put his foot in it kind of thing.
Yes, he was a bit rash.
Yeah. What about you? Do you have a favorite?
Yeah, I think I've grown to appreciate my patron saint, Saint Stephen. There's lots of Saint Stephens, but my patron saint is Stephen the martyr, the first martyr of the faith, the deacon, the Greek-speaking deacons that were ordained. And so his witness has always been something to me that's always challenging to me. So, you know, one of the things about having saints is that we're supposed to imitate their virtues. So I always look at that and Stephen continues to challenge me on a daily basis.
Yeah, because how far are you willing to go, right?
Yeah, I mean, in the imitation of Christ, you know, to forgive those who are killing you. I mean, that was he does that. You know, he asks for their forgiveness while they're stoning him, and that's a big challenge to me. That's like continual reminder I have a long ways to go.
Yes. Don't we all? But there's a lot of saints. There's so many saints, and my wife is quite enamored with the saints, and she's always looking for a good book. She's on this quest for like the best saint book, and she you never find one that's quite good enough. You find one that's got a lot of details, but then it doesn't say what you're the patron saint of or something like that. So it's hard to find a
complete.
She's
looking for a complete book, yeah.
But it's amazing some of their stories. She was telling me about some saint, obviously, but he was a priest, and he was saying mass, and he caught a whiff of somebody cooking meat in the distance or something like that, and it distracted him. And I guess he felt so guilty from being distracted during the celebration of the Mass that from that moment on, he just swore off meat for the rest of his life. He's like, I'm not going to give in to something that distracts me from the Lord. And I was like, wow. That is a big commitment, especially since last time we talked, I was talking about cooking meat for everybody. So maybe whoever that guy is, I need to study him more.
I'll be interested to know who that was.
Yeah, she'll know because her memory is like a steel trap. She remembers everything. So, why does the Catholic Church have saints? What is the deal with not just capital saints. S saints, but lowercase s saint and everything?
Lowercase s.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that the Council Fathers of the Second Vatican Council wanted to remind us of is that we're all called to sanctity. We're all called to life of holiness, that the call to sanctity is a universal call. There are no grades of sanctity, right? So everybody's called to live a holy life. So it's not like, oh, it's for somebody else, not me. No, if you're baptized, then yes, you're called to sanctity. And so within the church, the title of saint, capital S, is given to a member of Christ, and the members of Christ are small s, saints. We have that in the scriptures as well when greetings to the saints in the church of Corinth or wherever, right? So this member of Christ is recognized by the greater church as worthy of honor, and it's to honor their imitation of Christ or a virtue that they exemplified. So in our day and time, when someone is raised to the altars, it means that an individual member has been presented as a model of Christian life and has exemplified heroic virtue in their life. Heroic virtue means that the practice of virtue in their life was extraordinary and constant, right? So after the person is presented to the church, usually the local diocese is where the process begins. There's an investigation into their lives to see if it truly was exemplary. And then there are stages to this process. The first one, if they pass the first stage, they are declared a servant of God. And as the process continues, and they continue to move forward in the process, and they're designated as venerable or worthy of veneration, right? Worthy of asking for their help or their intercession. And then after venerable, then they come into the category of being blessed. And then finally, after blessed, then when they're approved and there miracles attributed to their intercession, then they're finally proclaimed saints. So there are a number of miracles that are required that have to be attributed to the intercession of this particular candidate for sainthood as well. I'm remembering right now one of our friars had to actually give a deposition to a tribunal because he was a witness to a little girl who had been whose liver was poisoned through Tylenol, because Tylenol can poison your liver if you overdose. And it was through the intercession of Teresa Benedicta, also known as Edith Stein, this Cast Carmelite cloistered nun. It was through her intercession that this little girl's liver was miraculously restored. And he had to give a deposition on that. And of course, the doctors have to give a deposition into all the medical records and everything. All things have to happen. And so it's not a matter of just calling somebody a saint. They have to have lived a virtuous life, and also that through their intercession that they're capable of interceding for in a miraculous way for those of us that are in the church in space and time.
Yeah, and the church is not, and I think that especially the more modern aspects of the church, and I would assume probably moving forward in time too, the church seems to not be in a big rush to validate miracles and all sorts of things. With so much science, I guess, out there, everyone's like, prove it, right? But the process it's not a fast process. I remember when Pope John Paul II passed away, it's almost like people were just calling out immediately, right? Oh, make him a saint, make him a saint, make him a saint. Well, it doesn't work that way. You don't just make him.
It's not by popular acclamation.
Yeah.
And there is an investigation, and it is something that is very seriously undertaken, the investigation and you have theologians and philosophers and medical people involved and all sorts of people, and you have people that will speak against the person again, so that, is this really a miracle, or is this something that can be explained naturally, or there's all these different things that are involved in it. And it takes a while too, because again, the church in her wisdom knows that it takes time to investigate these things thoroughly, and it's not just out of, again, popular acclamation or because someone is trending at the moment doesn't necessarily make them someone who should be raised to the altars as someone to be imitated in their virtue.
Yeah. Do you know how does this happen every year? Is there a time of year or a celebration or a feast or a holy day that coincides with the naming of saints publicly by the church?
No, usually it is associated with the person's near their person's anniversary of death. It's usually associated because they're passing on from space and time into the greater reality, the greater life, and it is considered the transitioning from a spatial temporal existence into that existence in Christ, who is outside of space and time. And so it's usually around the date of death. In fact, when they talk about Saint Francis, the Franciscans talk about the transitus, the transitioning from earthly life into eternal life. So it's usually around the date of their death.
Right. So that's kind of interesting because as we were thinking about this episode, this all developed over time. This kind of thought of transitioning from life to death and what that means. So how did the church get to this point, starting all the way back from the Old Testament?
Yes, it's something that we have to remember, and it's hard because the church has been, the community in space and time has been here for over 2,000 years. And so as the church grows, it is an organic entity, right? It's not just a bureaucracy. It is a living, breathing entity. It is the bride of Christ. And it develops and it grows like any organic creature does. So the theology of sanctity grew and developed over time with the community. So the word saint comes from the Latin sanctus, which signifies holy or holiness. And in our sacred scriptures, it is God who is the Holy One. It is God who is the All-Holy. And we have in the Apocalypse, in the book of Revelation, we have the angels proclaim God to be holy, holy, holy. So the essence of holiness itself. And it is because God is, as the angels say, thrice holy. And it is also because we are made in the image and likeness of God that he invites us, his people, to share in his sanctity, his holiness, and his divine life. So it's important to remember that revelation takes time. It's part of the culture, and it's how the person is capable, or the cultures are capable of understanding this.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. The word, so sanctus or to sanctify, to make holy, is it helpful when thinking about the saints? Like, how do I say this? So I've always considered the word holy, because it can seem a little intimidating to live a holy life, to think of yourself as trying to be a holy person. It just seems kind of maybe out of reach sometimes. But for me, it became helpful to think of it more as set apart, right? Like consecrated, like something.
Yes.
If you have something blessed, it's made holy, but it's still what it is. It's just reserved maybe for something specific, or it's
Correct.
set apart.
And
I don't know how to say it. Yeah.
It doesn't eliminate the earthly element or the human element. Sanctity doesn't eradicate our human nature. And so it is this, again, and as I said before, it's, if you take into consideration, it's all a process and a growth. Every person is growing, right? I always tell people it's about making better choices.
Yeah.
Can you make better choices? Are you informed enough to make better choices? And that's how sanctity develops in our lives. It's not about religiosity, or what I call performance spirituality. It's not about performing things and doing things and a list of tasks to execute and accomplish. It's conversion. It is a process of dying to the old self and making better choices, and making choices that are coherent with the gospel that we profess.
Yeah.
And again, we understand that differently as the church continues to grow in space and time. Our understanding of that deepens and widens and is more again, more organic. It's the taking into account the entire person.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of Father Larry Richards?
Yes, I have heard of him. Yes, the name is
Yeah.
familiar.
I listened to one of his talks, and he said you can become a saint or you can go to hell, and he says it so off the cuff, but ultimately it's true, right? If you get to heaven, you're a saint.
It's a choice that we make.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, what was this like way back at the beginning, right? Because you're saying it evolves over time.
It evolves, and so going back to our roots, the Judaic Christian roots, the Judaism. In the Old Testament, the idea of the just is very present, and so for the members of the First Covenant in the Old Testament, holiness and sanctity is seen as being just. We see that Abram is called just because of his faith in the God of the covenant, right? Because God calls him and he moves in faith. And because of his faith, he is called just or justified or righteous. Later on, as this people develops and grows in their relationship with this God, later on, justice or being just is linked to the observance of the Sinai covenant. And justice or holiness then became linked to a set of behaviors or actions, which also then led to the idea of ritual purity. To be able to be just is to be able to participate in the liturgy. And so there was a ritual purity. You had to be careful about not coming into contact with Gentiles, because the Gentiles were unbelievers and thereby would render you impure. And so you had to keep yourself free from defilement so as to be able to participate in the worship of God. And in the New Testament, we've got the example of the Pharisees. So over time, what happened is then this idea of justice and holiness gets a little bit skewed. And it's not about having faith in God the Father as Abram did, but it becomes skewed in the idea of ritual purity and purity of religiosity. And so as it becomes skewed from God's original desire for his people to live a covenantal life of mercy and forgiveness, he raises up the prophets that teach that ritual purity is meant to be a sign and a symbol of the pure conscience of the believer. And that's something that we should all strive to live. In other words, my religious or the purity of religiosity or the purity to be able to be ritually pure is supposed to be just a symbol of, we would say, our soul, right? Am I free from all those things that would render me a bad example? And that's why we have in the Old Testament, the spirituality of the Old Testament is, be careful, take care of the alien. Remember, you're aliens yourselves. Be careful of the foreigner. Care for the foreigner. You're a foreigner yourself. Take care of the widow and the orphan. All those things is a matter of being aware and considerate of others, just as God is considerate and aware of their need.
Yeah. There's so we're listening to the Bible in a Year podcast, and we just finished up Exodus, and so Exodus and Leviticus. So yeah, we just got all of the how to worship that one could possibly ever want. But it is very interesting how the description of worship, I think, is so important because, like you're saying, he's calling them into this mindfulness, right? Like, even you were slaves, so if they own slaves, you do it like this because you're not going to lord it over them, you're not going to abuse them, you're not going to whatever, because you were slaves, right? You understand what it was like,
Correct.
like you're saying, to be lost and wanderers. Now I'm going to give you a home, and the same thing. The prescription of worship seems to teach them. It's supposed to teach them how to live, almost, right? Like, how do I exist?
Right.
What is that mindfulness that I'm called to in every aspect? If
Right.
it's talking about trading or purchasing property, or how I interact with the stranger, how do I interact with the poor, right? And yeah, and he is So it is really interesting because it's classic human, right? We get something really
Yeah.
nice, and there's lots of love and logic and wisdom behind this, and then we screw it up, right? And just
Well,
let's
because
take it and mess it up.
it's
Yeah.
it's it's easier to focus on tasks instead of a real conversion of heart. So whenever I talk or I preach on the covenant, the Sinai covenant, it's like, yeah, you have the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments are not the covenant. The covenant is, you belong to me, I am your God, and you are my people. That's the covenant. The Ten Commandments are manifestations or signs of that covenant, and people forget that, and they talk about the Ten Commandments. They're like, yes, 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 but a covenantal life is not about the Ten Commandments. A covenantal life is, do I recognize that I belong to God? And there's something here too, something cultural in terms of the East. So, have you ever seen Lawrence of Arabia?
Oh, not anytime recently, but yeah.
Okay. So you know how he saves this guy from dying, right? And so all of a sudden he owes him his life.
Yeah.
That's a very Oriental, that's a very Eastern idea. And this is part of the idea of Israel being redeemed from death, slavery, is that, well, God has redeemed them from death. So now they owe him their lives. And so in their lives, it's not like a tyrannical owning, but like, okay, so if your life is mine, now I'm telling you, you have to be like me. You have to be compassionate and merciful and understanding. And again, care for the widow and the orphan and the alien and the foreigner. And that's a lot harder than just going like, you shall not kill, you shall not do this. It's the conversion is a lot harder than just the 10. And sometimes when I want to be a jerk, and I can be a jerk. Sometimes they talk about the Ten Commandments. I go, which ones? There's the Deuteronomy and there's Leviticus. So which one are you talking about? And they go like, what? like so
yeah, and
again,
and it's funny too because I think this is why reading Jesus in the New Testament, if you're actually paying attention, if you're actually reading, it's very powerful. It's very interesting, right? So he's the kind of guy who's like, it says, don't kill, thou shalt not kill. But if you even looked at the guy and you're upset, guilty, right? So he's calling us to understand the heart of the law more so than the law, which obviously is he's calling us into relationship and allowing us to have that relationship with God.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up because in the New Testament we see then that as God had raised the prophets in the Old Testament, we see that Jesus as definitive prophet, he reemphasizes this whole idea of righteousness and holiness, and that justice is founded upon compassion, mercy, and forgiveness of God the Father. Well, it is revealed that there is God the Father as well. So this is what the covenant is really about. It's making present this experience of mercy that Israel had received. You have to integrate it and make it coherent and share it and be merciful. One of the vocations or the vocation of Israel is, and it's supposed to be the light of the nations. So by the way that they live their covenantal life, they should attract others. They should, by their being compassionate and merciful, then that others are going to be attracted to this, and then they become the light of the nations. But they kind of forget that, and they kind of get focused on, again, ritual purity, right? And it's about us, and it's about we're the chosen ones, and it's about God being in Israel and only for Israel. And so this is why Jesus comes and sort of reminds them of this universal call to holiness that God has always uttered to us, right? Or invited us into.
There's a trap here I always think of the Star Wars fish guy thing that says it's a trap. But you can't blame the Pharisees, because like they had,
No.
if you've read the Old Testament, it's nothing but the Jewish people messing everything up all the time, right? And so they get to a point where these people, and Paul is maybe a really good example, right? There was a reason he was killing Christians, because he was like, no, you have to do this the right way. Look at our entire history. Look at all the times we've done it wrong. Like, all you got to do is follow directions, right? And then
Right.
obviously then he realizes that there's more to it than that, and through his conversion.
No. And you're right in saying that there's absolutely no malice or evil intent on the part of the Pharisees and that whole religious culture. It's easy for a whole people to take something for granted over time. Look at ourselves. I mean, as
Yeah.
Catholics, over time, there are things that we just kind of sort of take for granted, and we kind of drift away. And it's not that we intentionally forget something. It's that, like, well, over time, again, the truism that familiarity breeds contempt is that you don't really value something that is there all the time. And for myself, and I guess for yourself too, as cradle Catholics, sometimes to see others enter into the church with such fire and zeal and stuff, I go like, wow,
Yeah.
okay, so
Yeah.
good for you.
Yeah. It's like they're so excited. Anybody who I've ever
Yes.
met who goes through like RCIA or whatever, they're so excited for these opportunities, these moments for their life, for everything. And there's so many people
Yeah.
that just kind of, well, culturally Christian, culturally Catholic, and yeah, it's
Right.
very weird because you do. I feel like I see lots of people who are either laissez-faire, like Christian, it's just their culture, or they're the Pharisees and the scribes, and they just condemn everything and overlook the
Yes.
nuance that I think is necessary to, as you're talking earlier, just how Israel's supposed to be this light through how they live. And
Right.
we as Christians,
Right.
you don't put the basket over the lamp, right? You're
You're
supposed
correct.
to, your life should draw people to Christ. And you should have those moments
Right.
where people are like, why are you doing this? Well, because I love you, and why not, right? Like, not because I'm supposed to, not because I'm commanded to, but because you deserve it, whether you like it or not. And I'm blessed to have this
And I think
opportunity
that's
to be
a
that.
key. I think that's a key element that you've just touched on, and that is, it's not about being duty bound. Yeah, we are duty bound, but if you only exercise your Christianity or Catholicity from duty, it's going to be lifeless. It's mechanical, and it's. Then you worry about the perfection of execution, then, and you get caught up in perfectionism and sometimes even scruples. But if you really understand that this is a process, again, of making better choices, that because God the Father loves me, and I believe that God the Father loves me in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ, and has blessed me with the gift of the Holy Spirit, if I believe those doctrinal truths and I integrate them and they become part of a coherent life, then my reaching out to others is not out of duty. It's a natural consequence of allowing the Father's love in Christ and the Spirit to change me, to transform me, right? And this is something, again, too, I want to say something about this, is that our understanding, or I should say the Catholic understanding of holiness, is not a personal holiness. It's not a holiness that is, it's John's holiness or Stephen's holiness. It is a holiness of Christ who dwells in us. It is the manifestation of the holiness of God. We have all been blessed through the grace of baptism to have everything that we need for sanctity. This gift that we've been blessed with. And it's a matter of understanding that our Christianity, our Catholicity, our education in this school of charity is about actuating that gift. What am I doing to actuate that gift of love? And it's there. And for some people, it stays dormant for many, many years until they have an awakening or they have an encounter. And others, it's a matter of again, God moves them in a particular way and they cooperate with that movement and they begin to discover that gift, that the blessedness of the Father's love. And they really, really believe and they understand and in their heart, the marrow of their bones, that they are beloved children of the Father, and then they begin to live that way. That the love of the Father then casts out that servile fear of performance and perfectionism.
Yeah.
And so again, it's something that we all have and we're all called to, and it's not a holiness that is personal. It is a manifestation of the holiness of Christ in each one of us in an individual way and in a unique way, because your history and my history are different, and so the way it's going to manifest itself is going to be according to your history and your particular way of manifesting that holiness that is Christ's and is given to us.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I didn't mean to preach. I'm sorry.
No, it's good, and it's so interesting as you're talking. It makes me realize equally how all of this goes back to the saints and
Yes.
our understanding, because I have a personal maturity and understanding that grows, and so do you, but so does the church, because we're this strange mystical body where we are the same church kind of thing. And
Yes.
the same way that I've heard when we pray, it's because we are responding to God's invitation to pray with him, to
Yes.
be with him, and there's a maturity that goes with that. And equally, if you're anything like me, there's a maturity that develops where you start to recognize resistances in your life, and you're like, I don't want to pray. Why don't I want to pray? Why don't I want to do this? Why don't I want to help the person, right? Oh, maybe I should because I'm duty bound. Nope, that's not the right way. So why? Let me figure out and really dig in why and where can I grow? Where can I convert? Because conversion, I really believe, is lifelong. If you're doing it right, it should be lifelong, in my opinion. So
It is.
So as we are maturing, as we're growing, the church is doing the same things, because 2,000 years ago, its understanding of sanctity or sainthood or holiness or justification or righteousness, that begins to change, right? And that takes us back
Yes.
to holiness and sanctity, meaning more so now we look at a saint as somebody who has died, so somebody who's with God. So how did we get to that?
Yeah. Well, before I comment on that, I want to say that sometimes we have to rely on on duty and responsibility until it becomes something natural to us, right? So
Obedience.
Yeah, sometimes, we have to, and sometimes that's where the discipline comes, and eventually discipline becomes something that becomes love if we continue to understand what it is that God is calling us to.
And that, I guess,
And
just
again, going back
to jump in, sorry, it's very much like
Go ahead.
the Old Testament prescription of worship, right? And
Yes.
how they goofed it up, because you don't want to just focus on the what. It's really important that we learn the why.
Exactly. So, a little bit about the saints that have gone before us. Again, we all belong to this huge community. There's those that are enjoying God now, and those of us that are in space and time, and those that are being purified in the doorstep or the threshold to being with the Lord. So it goes back to kind of the theology of the just and the development of the idea of the soul as well. And again, going back to this whole idea that we are an organic, developing body, believing community. And because everything in the church is connected to and as a result of some previously accepted truth, the originating truth being that Jesus Christ is true God and true man, the theology of the saints is connected with the theology of the just, as we said earlier in the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, the idea of being just comes from a foundation of a legal justice. So to be declared just was almost the same thing as saying someone was found innocent. But this legal innocence, again, because it was a religious community, the Israel, because it is a religious population, a religious community, this idea of legal innocence was seen as proof of the interior innocence, that somehow God had named them. It is through God's intervention that they were called and named to be just. So again, there's this whole idea that the thread of the theology of justification, and that can be a whole other topic.
Yeah, I was
right,
just thinking that's a whole podcast, because the whole justification,
that's several, I think,
faith
probably.
alone. Yeah, there's a lot to dig in there.
Yeah, how we understand justification, how we understand divine revelation, all those things. There's a Catholic perspective to that.
Mm-hmm.
So, leaving that aside, the whole idea of justification, leaving that aside for now, if we follow the thread of innocent or just members who live rightly, then what happens is, as they're living rightly, what happens then when this person who is faithful to the covenant is living a covenantal life? What happens to them when they suffer, when they're being persecuted? This whole idea of how is it that the just suffer? And if I'm living rightly and I'm living the covenant, why is it that suffering is present in my life, right? And it's a matter then of the just is seen to be as someone who lives rightly, who lives this covenantal life in spite of, we would say today, in spite of the brokenness of the world, right? Mm-hmm. In spite of the persecution that they suffered, in spite of tragedies that they suffer, right? And so that became part of this development of the idea of innocence and justice and sanctity. Again, we automatically presume the idea or belief in the permanence of the person because we're very influenced by Greek culture.
Yeah, it wasn't always that way, right?
No. It was something that was slow to develop. And in the Old Testament, it began to be something that began to develop and began to be part of the consideration, right, in the light of Revelation and God's intervention through the sacred authors, the inspired authors of the Scriptures. And at first, they had believed that the person would live on in the memory of God, not necessarily a soul, but that God would remember them, right? And then the rest, the unjust, or those that were not holy, they lived on in the memory of their descendants, which is another reason why it was so important to have descendants, is so that their memory would continue on in their descendants. That's how they lived on, in their descendants.
Yeah, it's always easiest. It's always easiest for to interject. I'm really enjoying interrupting you today. The difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees is when I heard that the Pharisees believed in life after death, and the Sadducees didn't, and that's why they were sad. You see?
Yes, exactly. That's a good way to remember. And again, if you remember your Bible stories and the New Testament stories, that was the big fight between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. When Paul says that he was inspired by an angel, all of a sudden, all hell broke loose because the Pharisees and the Sadducees started fighting about how do we know that an angel didn't speak to him. So again, going back to the Old Testament and the just, we have examples of innocent people suffering. And you have the example of Job, who is tried, and God allows Satan to try him, and he's a just man. You have the example of Susanna, who was blackmailed by two old
were they judges or they were politically important.
They're judges, the judges of Israel, and so they were lusting after Susanna, and so she wouldn't give in to them, so they accused her of something else, and it's sort of like Old Testament revenge, sort of
or it's like CSI Israel. Is that Daniel who spoke up?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, Daniel's one that speaks up and
becomes a
against
prophet.
her persecution. Yes. And then again, you have the person or the entity of Israel suffering persecution for its belief in the one true God. So as all this is happening, right, then you have the Greek idea of the soul or the nous, the mind, right, emerged and developed, and this began to be considered in the reflections, in the writings of the sacred scriptures. So then this leads to the development of the belief in the resurrection of the just, which led also to the development of the idea of a netherworld. So if the just continue to exist afterwards, where do they exist? So this idea of a netherworld, where the just await the final day, the day of the Lord. And this netherworld is what was named Sheol. And because this is a place where the just wait for the coming of the day of the Lord, there's also the idea of the resurrection of the unjust. And so where do they go? And so the unjust, this idea of suffering for their lack of justice, they developed the idea of Gehenna. Now, Gehenna was actually a physical place outside of Jerusalem where they burned all the trash. And so where all the trash was burned, then that became sort of like this continual burning. So then they began to use that as the symbol of the fire or the suffering that would await the unjust, the perpetual suffering of the unjust for not living their covenantal life. So with this idea of Sheol, going back to this idea of the development of the soul, at first, as I said, you lived on in the memory of God, or you lived on in the memory of your descendants, and then this idea of the soul and the permanence of the person, and then the Sheol. And so, but for them it was a very shadowy existence, part of I guess the Greeks and the Romans would call Hades. It's a very shadowy existence. It's not a real, not the entire person, right? The shadow of themselves, right? And later on, as the scriptures develop and revelation begins to make itself known to the sacred writers, we have this idea of the permanence of the soul. We have a glimpse of that in the book of Maccabees. So where Judas Maccabees, there was a battle and all these people in his army were killed. And the ones that were killed, they were found to have an amulet, which was, again, a defilement.
Yeah.
Right? You shouldn't do that because
don't need lucky charms kind of thing.
Right, exactly, because it's sort of idolatry and defilement, right? And so what he does is he gathers together offerings, money, and he sends the money to Jerusalem to offer up prayers for the dead. You're like, okay, well, so that infers then that there is a life after death, that there is some permanence of the person, right? Yeah, and it's also in Maccabees.
Go ahead.
So also in Maccabees, you also have the example that is given to us of the mother and her 7 sons who are persecuted for not offering incense, right? And so she speaks to them and tells them in their language, that to be faithful to God. And they all 7, and including the mother, they're all willing to die because they know that their life is held in the hand of God, and the God is faithful, and they will continue to live. And at the resurrection of the just, since they're dying for God, that they will have a new life.
Are both Maccabees books absent from the Protestant Bible?
Yes.
Okay.
They don't have Maccabees, and they don't have Susanna either. They got rid of everything that was not in Hebrew. Yeah. Which is interesting because when Jesus quotes scripture,
he quotes a whole lot.
The Greek. Yeah. He quotes the Greek translation, the Septuagint.
Yeah, I love that they defer to the to the Jewish tradition over the Christian tradition eventually.
Right? Well, yeah, and part of it too was the reason the Jews got rid of the Greek translation was because a lot of people were being converted to Christ using the Septuagint translation. And so they say, okay, we're not going to use the Septuagint translation anymore. Let's not use that anymore. And so that was one of the reasons. And then later on, for other reasons, Luther decided to get rid of them, and other people decided to get rid of them because for some reason or another. And we'll talk about that some other time.
Yeah.
But the canon of Scripture. And so again, going back to this whole idea of the innocent suffering. So we have Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus is the ultimate innocent person who suffers, and he's condemned to die. So he dies an innocent. He dies as an innocent, and he dies just as a just man. But then, how is it this just innocent man is condemned to death and this capital execution? And so he is seen then as the ultimate witness to the absolute truth of God above all things. And so this is where we get into the whole idea of martyrdom, because martyrdom is to be a martyr is to be a witness. And so again, it comes from the culturally Greek world of the time of Jesus, that this is a word that was used in court as well, to witness or to testify. So Jesus is considered the king of martyrs. And so then now we come to this whole idea of sanctity and saints. And for us as Catholics, Catholic Christians, the majority of the saints in the first couple hundred years were all martyrs.
Yeah.
Because they all were dying. They were all dying for the faith.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's probably, honestly, that's a good segue for a whole nother set of conversations. Something that also might be interesting to talk about is very specifically the difference between the Christian concept of soul and the Greek concept. They're not the same, but it's really easy for us to think of just, oh, my soul is just this disembodied kind of, I don't know, my thought goes out to heaven or something like that, or my consciousness or something.
Right.
But it's way more complicated than that.
Yes.
Yeah. So let me see if I can track this all together, make sure I was following all of this, because it's a lot to think about.
It is. Yeah.
So we have justification, being somebody who's just, righteous, blameless, obedient, perhaps following. Like we have Abraham, he was just, he was willing to do what was asked for him, kind of thing. Eventually, we kind of end up with this ledger mentality, like rights or wrongs. If it's striking the book against you, you're not being morally just or righteous. If you're clean or blameless, then you might be remembered by God. And then as the Greek cultures creep in, we start doing a lot more thinking, I guess. Those Greeks, they're always thinking. And so then we start, where do we go if we die? And if we're just, do we go one place? And if we're not just, we go a different place. And we end up with kind of the precursors of heaven and hell and Sheol and Gehenna.
Yes.
Instead of just a afterlife, now there's consequential afterlives.
Yes.
Man, it's good stuff. It's so fun to dig into all of this, because because it tangents off in so many different directions, right? Because we can.
And that's one thing about the faith, is that everything is connected to something else. And so again, we talked the other day, if you start following one thread, you have to cross all these other threads. You're like, oh yeah, there's this thread, and oh, there's this, but we can't go there right now. We got to keep following this thread, because it's all interconnected. It's all part of one organic being, right? And I said, I think we talked the other day, is that we can talk about our nervous system, we can talk about our circulatory system, we can talk about, and there's different systems, but it's all part of one body. Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of the same thing when we talk about the different parts of the church. You have to remember that it's part of a whole, even though we're concentrating on one particular aspect. So we're looking at the fifth metatarsal today of the church, and so but you have to remember it's connected to the body. So
and it's developing. It didn't just develop; it's developing. So
developing, yes, until we come to full maturity, yes.
It's very, very interesting. All this also makes me kind of think about maybe future episodes with heaven and hell, angels and
Ooh.
devils, or Satan, right? Because we have these
Yeah.
angelic beings that, do they live in heaven? Do they live in hell? It seems kind of popular right now to for Satan to be more of a thought than an actuality, and
A reality.
yeah. So that's maybe another rabbit trail for us one of these days.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's in the not too far past in the church, one of the topics was the four last things, and the four last things are death. So after death, then there's the second last thing, which is judgment, and then after judgment, there's the other two last things, which is heaven and hell. So the four last things was death, judgment, heaven, and hell. So those are things to consider, right? So yeah, and of course, angels and demons and fallenness and all those things are part of that, right? So yeah, there's a lot to to dive into. I think it'd be fun. I think it's going to be fun.
Yeah. Well, thanks for chatting with me today. I really appreciate it. It was fun. And
You're very welcome.
yeah,
Thank you for the questions.
Yeah. And to anyone listening, if you like what you hear, please consider subscribing wherever you found us, right? If you find us on YouTube, give us a subscribe for us, and ring the little bell or click the bell icon, whatever it is that you do on YouTube. And, we really look forward to kind of chatting with you again later.
And sharing our faith.
Yep.
God bless.